They were given scraps, pig feet, corn husks, and wild weeds. Yet from almost nothing, enslaved people built a food culture that still feeds America today. These weren't just meals, they were survival. Every dish carried pain, resilience, and a story that most history books leave out. In this video, we're uncovering 25 survival foods of slaves on plantations. These are the forgotten meals that kept people alive through one of the darkest chapters in history, and the hidden roots of dishes still on our tables today. Stick around because some of these will shock you. 1. Parched corn. These were toasted, dried kernels. When hunger hit hard in the fields, there wasn't always a pot or fire available to cook a full meal. That's where parched corn came in. Enslaved people would toast dried kernels until they turned brown and popped with flavor. It was portable, it was filling, and it could last for weeks without spoiling. Think of it as their original trail mix, except it wasn't for hiking trips, it was for survival. Parched corn provided enough energy to push through backbreaking work, and sometimes it was all a person had to eat for an entire day. Fast forward to today, and you'll see echoes of it in kettle corn at a fair or the roasted corn nuts sold in gas stations. But for those living on plantations, this wasn't a snack. It was life or death. And here's the twist. This simple survival food didn't just keep people alive. It became the seed of Southern food traditions that we still taste today. But what happened when the corn ran out? The answer was another dish so plain and so bare bones that it shocked even visiting outsiders. 2. Boiled cornmeal mush. If parched corn was the pocket food of survival, then cornmeal mush was the hot meal that kept folks going at night. It was just cornmeal, water, and salt, boiled until it thickened into a heavy porridge. There was no milk, no butter, and none of the extras we throw in today. It was just enough to quiet an empty stomach. This dish was so common, it showed up in slave narratives again and again. Sometimes it was ladled into wooden troughs where children would gather around with spoons, eating side by side like piglets in a pen. It was brutal and humbling, but it kept them alive. Here's the part that sticks. Mush wasn't just dinner. Cold leftovers were sliced and fried the next day, turning into something closer to polenta cakes. That simple stretch, boiling once and frying twice, doubled the food supply and saved scraps that might have gone to waste. Fast forward to today and you'll still see its shadow in Southern fried cornmeal cakes or even Italian polenta fries on restaurant menus. But for the enslaved, mush was survival stripped bare, plain, heavy, and unforgettable. 3. Turnip green stew. When scraps of meat were scarce, and they almost always were, enslaved families turned to the earth itself. Turnip greens, those bitter leaves most folks tossed aside, became the backbone of survival stews. They were boiled soft and seasoned with nothing more than a pinch of salt, or maybe a scrap of pork fat if you were lucky. This wasn't comfort food. It was endurance food. But here's the thing. Greens carried more than just calories. They gave strength. They filled the belly with warmth when winter winds cut through thin clothes and bare cabins. A pot of turnip greens simmering on a fire wasn't just food. It was hope stretched into a meal. Over time, that bitter, earthy flavor became familiar and even cherished. Families passed down ways to soften the bite through slow cooking, mixing in roots, or adding in whatever scraps they could find. And that tradition echoes loud today. Walk into a Southern kitchen and you'll still see pots of greens on the stove, collards, mustards, or turnips seasoned up and served with cornbread. But for the enslaved, it started with survival, not taste. It was a stew made of leaves, stalks, and scraps most people wouldn't touch. 4th, cowpea stew. Long before black-eyed peas were a New Year's tradition, they were a survival food on the plantations. Enslaved Africans carried knowledge of cowpeas with them across the ocean. These were hardy beans that grew well in the southern heat and poor soil. They were cheap, filling, and packed with protein. They were a lifeline when meat was just a memory. Cowpea stew was simple. Boil the beans soft, add a little salt, and maybe toss in a scrap of pork rind if you had it. Sometimes it simmered with wild herbs or onions from the fields, but more often it was just beans and water, plain, heavy, and sustaining. But here's the powerful twist. Cowpeas weren't just survival food. They were a taste of home. For many enslaved people, this was one of the few foods that tied them back to Africa, where cowpeas had been cooked for generations in stews and porridges. Eating them wasn't just filling the belly, it was holding on to a piece of identity in a world trying to erase it. And today, that legacy is alive every time black-eyed peas are served with rice or simmered into Hoppin' John. What started as a survival stew is now a symbol of luck, prosperity, and Southern tradition. But survival wasn't always planted or grown. Sometimes it was plucked straight from the dirt and boiled down into something barely edible. 5. Dandelion greens boiled soft. When you think of dandelions today, you probably picture weeds in the yard, something to spray or pull out. But for enslaved families, those so-called weeds were a gift from the earth. Dandelion greens grew wild, needed no planting, and filled pots when nothing else was left. Boiled soft, the greens lost some of their bitterness, though not all. Sometimes they were flavored with a splash of vinegar or maybe a sliver of fat, but most days it was just greens and water. It was a thin broth and a chewy bite, just enough to take the edge off hunger. Here's the hidden beauty. Dandelions carried nutrients like iron and vitamins that provided strength. Even if plantation owners didn't know or care, enslaved cooks understood that these weeds were more than filler. They were survival medicine, and this survival food didn't fade away. In parts of the South, dandelion greens were eaten well into the 20th century, and today they've circled back as a trendy superfood in fancy restaurants and health stores. Imagine that. What was once desperation food now sells for $5 a bundle. But if bitter weeds could become a meal, imagine what happened when the rare sweetness of sugar trickled into enslaved hands. 6. Molasses water, a sweet ration drink. Sugar was money on the plantations, and enslaved people rarely tasted it. But every so often they'd be given a ration of molasses. It was thick, dark, and sticky. It wasn't candy, but it was sweet, and that sweetness meant everything. The simplest way to make it last was to stir a spoonful into a tin cup of water. That was molasses water, a poor man's energy drink. It gave quick calories and a burst of sweetness in a life where flavor was almost always bitter. For children, that cup was a rare treat. For adults, it was fuel, enough to push through another day in the fields. Sometimes it doubled as medicine too, mixed with herbs to soothe coughs or settle the stomach. What's wild is how much this echoes forward. Molasses water was survival, but it was also the seed of Southern desserts, barbecue sauces, and baked goods we love today. That sticky sweetness shaped the flavor of an entire region. But if molasses was rare gold, the next food was the opposite, scraps so unwanted that plantation owners tossed them aside. And yet, enslaved cooks turned them into a meal that still stirs debate today. 7. Salt pork scraps, fried or boiled. Meat was a luxury enslaved people almost never saw unless it was the parts nobody else wanted. That's where salt pork scraps came in. Plantation owners kept the hams, chops, and roasts, while the fat trimmings, rind, and scraps went to the slave quarters. Fried in a pan, those scraps released grease that seasoned everything from beans to greens. Boiled, they became chewy bites in a pot of stew. And when there wasn't even meat left, just the fat enslaved cook saved every drop, stretching it to flavor cornmeal mush or bitter greens. Here's the hard truth. Salt pork was never meant to be a gift. It was cheap, preserved, and considered unfit for proper tables. But in the hands of enslaved people, it became a cornerstone of survival cooking. That salty, smoky flavor carried through entire meals, making scraps taste like feasts. And the legacy. You can still taste it today. Southern soul food, from collard greens simmered with ham hock to fried cabbage with bacon, traces back to those scraps. What was once cast off has become comfort. But meat scraps weren't the only thing enslaved cooks transformed. When gardens and fields thinned out, they turned to pumpkins and wild greens, simmering them into a survival stew that fed entire families. 8. Pumpkin and wild greens pottage. When food was running thin, enslaved cooks had to get creative with whatever the land gave up. Pumpkins growing wild in patches and bitter greens from the fields often ended up together in one pot. The result was a pottage, a simple stew that was more survival than celebration. Chunks of pumpkin gave sweetness and body, while the greens, tough, bitter, and stringy, filled out the pot. Sometimes the whole thing simmered with just water and salt. Other times, if luck struck, a sliver of pork fat or a stray onion added flavor. Nothing was wasted and nothing was fancy, but together it made enough to share. Here's the thing. This wasn't just food, it was survival alchemy. It involved taking the bland, the bitter, and the unwanted and turning them into something warm and filling. That kind of cooking taught resourcefulness and endurance. And the echo still lingers. You can see it today in southern pumpkin soups, fall stews, and even the way greens get cooked down low and slow until they soften into comfort. What started as a poor man's pottage has become a backbone of seasonal cooking. But pumpkins held another secret too, not just the flesh, but the seeds. Roasted, salted, and eaten by the handful, they were the snack that carried people through the leanest days. 9. Roasted pumpkin seeds. After the pumpkin flesh went into the pot, nothing was thrown away, not even the seeds. Enslaved families would wash them, dry them, and roast them over hot coals with a little salt if they had it. The seeds became a rare, crunchy snack. They weren't just tasty. Pumpkin seeds packed protein and fat, offering a much-needed boost during times when food was scarce. Things that were scarce in a diet built mostly on grains and greens were essential for health. For children, especially, a handful of roasted seeds could mean the difference between going to bed starving and sleeping with at least a little comfort. Here's what makes it powerful. This was survival food born out of waste. What most plantation kitchens scooped out and tossed, enslaved cooks transformed into something useful and even enjoyable. That instinct to save, to stretch, and to make something from nothing defined survival. And it's a tradition that stuck. Today, roasted pumpkin seeds show up in snack bags at gas stations, sprinkled over salads, or even sold as superfoods in health stores. What was once desperation food now sells for many dollars. But while seeds could be roasted into a treat, the root of the turnip offered another kind of survival. It was roasted slowly until it was soft enough to stand in for bread or meat. 10. Turnip root roast. When bread was a luxury and meat was a dream, the humble turnip root became the next best thing. Dug straight from the dirt, scrubbed clean, and roasted in the ashes of a fire, it transformed from hard and bitter into something soft, earthy, and faintly sweet. Enslaved families treated roasted turnips like filler food, something to quiet hunger when cornmeal was gone. Sometimes it was eaten plain, sometimes mashed, and sometimes sliced thin and fried in pork fat if scraps were available. It was a poor man's potato and a survival man's bread. But here's the striking part. Roasting brought out a richness that made it almost feel like a treat. Imagine the smell of a smoky fire. The root was blackened on the outside and steaming on the inside. It wasn't just food, it was warmth, something you could hold in your hands on a cold night. And this practice didn't fade. Roasted root vegetables became part of southern kitchens, church suppers, and even holiday tables. What started as survival cooking carved a permanent place in American food traditions. But if the turnip root filled bellies, the next dish, a mash of corn and okra, carried flavors that connected enslaved Africans directly back to their homeland. 11. Okra and corn mash. Okra wasn't native to America. It came over on slave ships, carried in memory and in seeds hidden in cloth. On the plantations, it grew well in the southern heat, and enslaved cooks mixed it with the one crop they always had, corn. The result was okra and corn mash, a dish that was simple, filling, and tied directly to Africa. The mash was usually just okra pods sliced thin and boiled down with ground corn or grits until it became a thick, sticky stew. Sometimes it was slimy and sometimes gritty, but it was always enough to fill a stomach. When scraps of pork or onion were around, they'd get tossed in for flavor. But most nights it was just the two staples, corn and okra. Here's the deeper story. Every bite of this dish was survival, yes, but it was also cultural memory. Okra stews and corn porridges were already part of African diets long before slavery. So when enslaved families mixed them together in America, they weren't just eating. They were preserving a piece of who they were. And you still see it today. Gumbo, succotash, and southern okra dishes all trace back to that mash. What started as survival in slave quarters became flavor woven into the South's identity. But when food didn't grow in fields or gardens, survival sometimes meant chasing it down in the woods, like the sweet fruit of the persimmon tree. 12. Foraged persimmons, mashed or eaten raw. Sweetness was rare on the plantation table, which made persimmons feel like treasure. Growing wild in southern woods and fields, these small orange fruits looked harmless enough. But if you bite into one before it is ripe, your mouth puckers from the bitter taste. If you wait until the frost hits, however, that same fruit turns soft, sweet, and golden. Enslaved families knew the trick. They foraged persimmons late in the season, eating them raw or mashing them into pulp. Sometimes the mash was dried into thin cakes carried as a pocket food for long days in the fields. Other times it was stirred into water to make a kind of sweet drink, like nature's answer to molasses. Persimmons weren't just about flavor, they were about luck, timing, and knowledge of the land. Knowing when to pick them, how to prepare them, and how to stretch them made the difference between a bitter mistake and a rare moment of sweetness in an otherwise harsh life. And persimmons never disappeared. You can still find them in southern backyards, turned into puddings, breads, and even country wine. What was once a foraged survival fruit became a hidden jewel of southern cooking. But fruit wasn't always plentiful. More often, survival meant making do with broken grains, the cast-off pieces of rice that planters considered worthless. 13. Broken rice porridge, also known as Carolina middlings. On the Carolina plantations, rice was king, but enslaved families almost never saw the fine, polished grains that made planters rich. What they got instead were the middlings, broken bits of rice left over after milling. To the owners, it was waste. To the enslaved, it was survival. Those fragments were boiled into a thin porridge. Sometimes it was salted or mixed with scraps of beans or greens, but most of the time it was just rice and water. It wasn't fancy and it wasn't filling for long, but it was fuel for another day of work. Here's the striking part. Enslaved Africans already had deep knowledge of rice cultivation and cooking from their homelands. They knew how to coax flavor and sustenance from even the broken grains. And in that, they preserved not just their bodies, but their culture. That broken rice porridge was a lifeline. And over time, the idea of stretching humble rice into soups, porridges, and stews became a cornerstone of Southern kitchens. Even today, dishes like rice grits or congee-style porridges echo that same survival method. But when rice was gone, enslaved families turned to what the woods gave them. wild fruits that clung to vines and stained fingers purple, 14 wild muscadine grapes. Deep in the southern woods, tangled vines offered a secret gift: muscadine grapes. They were thick-skinned and bursting with juice. These wild grapes weren't the neat, seedless kind you see in stores today. They were messy, tart, and sometimes sweet enough to feel like a miracle. For enslaved families, muscadines were a rare taste of abundance. Children foraged for them, staining their hands and mouths purple, while adults mashed them into pulps or boiled them down for juice. If enough were gathered, the fruit could even be preserved into syrups, a way to stretch the sweetness into the lean months. Here's the deeper meaning. Muscadines weren't just food. They were freedom food. They grew outside the plantation's control in woods and thickets, ripe for the taking if you knew where to look. Finding them was a small act of independence and a reminder that the land still gave gifts even in the harshest times. And muscadines never left southern life. Today, they're turned into jellies, wines, and juices, prized as a native fruit. What once kept hunger at bay now sits bottled on store shelves. But the next food was no gift of the land. It came from the slaughterhouse, a cut so unwanted most people wouldn't touch it. 15 boiled cow tongue. On the plantation, the best cuts of beef never reached the slave quarters. But when a cow was butchered, parts like the tongue, tough, fatty, and considered undesirable, sometimes did. Enslaved cooks wasted nothing, and boiled cow tongue became both survival and ingenuity. The preparation was plain. The tongue was scrubbed and boiled for hours until tender, then sliced thin. Sometimes a pinch of salt or a splash of vinegar gave it flavor, but most of the time it was eaten just as it was, chewy, heavy, and filling. Here's the truth. Tongue wasn't just a scrap. It was a rare source of real protein and fat in a diet that leaned heavily on grains and greens. For families used to stretching vegetables and corn into meals, having actual meat, even from the tongue, felt like a victory. And what's fascinating is how that scrap transformed over time. Today, beef tongue is a delicacy in cuisines around the world, from tacos de lengua in Mexico to deli-style tongue sandwiches in New York. What the enslaved once ate out of necessity is now served on menus for a premium price. But when meat like this was rare, survival meant turning back to the grind, literally, with cracked corn boiled into plain grits. 16 cracked corn grits, plain. If there was one food that never disappeared from the slave diet, it was corn. Ground fine, it became mush. Left in bigger pieces, it became grits. Enslaved families boiled cracked corn in water until it swelled and softened into a thick, plain porridge. No butter, no cream, and no cheese. Just corn and water. This dish was filling, but it wasn't an indulgence. It was survival fuel. It was heavy enough to quiet the belly, simple enough to make in one pot, and cheap enough to always be on hand. Day after day, grits showed up at the table in some form, morning or night. Here's the part that resonates. Even though it was plain, grits became a foundation of Southern cooking. Over time, with seasoning, milk, or gravy, they turned from survival food into comfort food. But in the slave quarters, plain grits were often the first bite of the day, and sometimes the only one. It's a reminder of how staples endure. Today, grits are dressed up with shrimp in fancy restaurants or smothered with cheese at diners. But their root story is far grimmer. A bowl of cracked corn, keeping bodies alive under impossible conditions. And while grits warmed the body, enslaved families also turned to the woods for warmth in another way, steeping the roots of sassafras trees into a survival tea. 17 sassafras root tea. When water alone grew dull, enslaved families turned to the woods for flavor. The root of the sassafras tree, dug from the earth and boiled, made a tea unlike anything else. It was earthy, fragrant, and had a hint of sweetness. Long before root beer was ever bottled, Sassafras root tea was a survival drink. It wasn't just about the taste, it was also believed to help clean the blood and give strength for the hard labor ahead. Sassafras was believed to have healing powers. A hot cup of this tea soothed coughs, eased fevers, and provided comfort when no real medicine was available. For people forced to work from sunup to sundown with very little rest, that mattered deeply. Here's the striking part. Enslaved cooks weren't just boiling roots out of desperation. They carried deep herbal knowledge from Africa and learned new secrets from Native Americans, blending these traditions together to survive. Sassafras became more than just a drink. It was resilience in a cup, and this survival tea left a lasting mark. Centuries later, its unique flavor inspired root beer, a drink now loved worldwide. But its origin wasn't sweet soda and frosty mugs. It was enslaved families huddled by firelight, sipping warmth from a root pulled straight out of the ground. But not everything from the land was brewed or boiled. Some foods were preserved, like cucumbers and peppers dropped into brine to last through the lean months. 18 pickled cucumbers and peppers in brine. Fresh food never lasted long in the slave quarters, so preserving became a way to stretch the harvest. With just salt, water, and maybe some thyme, enslaved cooks turned cucumbers and peppers into sharp, tangy pickles that could last for weeks. The process was simple. Slice the vegetables, pack them into jars or crocks, and pour over the brine. After sitting for a few days, the crunch softened, but the flavor grew bold, sour, salty, and sometimes even spicy if peppers were used. For families eating plain corn mush or bitter greens, a pickle on the side was a burst of flavor that made survival meals bearable. Pickling wasn't just about taste, though. It was about security. When gardens and fields stopped producing, those jars of preserved vegetables meant there was still something to fall back on. A sour bite in the dead of winter could mean the difference between another day of strength and the edge of hunger. And the legacy remains. Southern kitchens never let it go. Chow chow, pepper relish, and bread and butter pickles all trace back to those first brined jars on the plantation. What started as a necessity became a beloved tradition. But not every survival food came from the garden. Sometimes it meant cracking open the hardest gifts of the forest, like black walnuts. They were bitter and stubborn, but worth the effort. 19 foraged black walnuts. If you've ever tried to crack open a black walnut, you know it's no easy task. The shells are very thick, the dark stain seeps into your hands, and the nut meat hides deep inside. But for enslaved families, black walnuts were worth every strike of a rock or hammer. Gathered from the forest floor, these nuts were prized for their richness. Once cracked, the kernels offered protein, fat, and a flavor far stronger than regular walnuts. Sometimes they were eaten raw. Other times, they were chopped and stirred into porridge or used to stretch a simple dessert when molasses was on hand. Here's the deeper truth. Black walnuts weren't just food. They were survival treasure. Every nut cracked meant energy stored and a small victory against hunger. Families would save them for lean months or carry them into the fields for quick strength, and over time their legacy spread. Black walnut cake, black walnut ice cream, and even old-fashioned candies all stem from a food-enslaved people first foraged out of necessity. What the land gave as a hardship, they turned into nourishment. But when nuts and fruit weren't around, survival meant scraping from the very core of the garden itself, boiling down cabbage hearts and stems that others would have thrown away. 20 stewed cabbage cores. On the plantation, the crisp outer leaves of cabbage might make it to the owner's table, but the tough, woody cores were tossed aside. In the slave quarters, however, cabbage cores weren't waste. They were boiled down, softened, and transformed into a survival stew. The cores were chopped and simmered for hours until the tough fibers gave way. Sometimes they were flavored with a pinch of salt, or if fortune smiled, a scrap of pork fat. More often it was just cabbage and water, thin and bland, but enough to put something warm in an empty belly. Here's what's powerful. Enslaved families had no room for waste. What others discarded, they found a way to eat. Those cabbage cores filled the pot and stretched meals a little further. In a world where every calorie counted, even the scraps mattered. And this resourcefulness left a mark. Southern kitchens to this day have recipes that use the whole vegetable, including stewed cabbage, braised stalks, and even pickled stems. What began as desperation cooking became part of the region's food identity. But not every preservation was so plain. Sometimes survival came with spice, like green tomato chow chow, a tangy relish that added a bite to otherwise bland meals. 21. Green tomato chow chow relish. When the harvest ended and tomatoes were left hanging green on the vine, enslaved cooks refused to let them go to waste. They chopped those unripe tomatoes and mixed them with peppers, onions, vinegar, and salt, then simmered it all into a sharp relish called chow chow. It was bright, tangy, and a little spicy. It was the kind of flavor that could cut through the heaviness of beans, corn mush, or boiled greens. A spoonful on the side turned plain survival food into something that actually sparked the taste buds. In a world where meals were usually bitter or bland, that mattered more than most people realized. But here's the bigger picture. Chow chow wasn't just about flavor, it was about preservation. By pickling and spicing what couldn't ripen, enslaved families stretched food into the cold months when gardens went bare. It was a survival strategy hidden in a relish jar, and its legacy still shines today. Southern tables, from barbecue joints to Sunday suppers, serve chow chow alongside meats, beans, and cornbread. What started as a way to save scraps has become a Southern tradition with roots deep in the slave quarters. But when vegetables weren't enough, people turned to the land again. This time, they roasted roots to brew a bitter drink that stood in for coffee. 22. Chicory coffee. Coffee was a luxury reserved for the big house, but in the slave quarters, enslaved families found their own substitute. They dug up the roots of the chicory plant, roasted them until they were dark, and ground them into a coarse powder. When brewed with hot water, it made a bitter, smoky drink that looked and felt like coffee, even if it wasn't. For many, chicory brew wasn't just about the taste, it was about the ritual. Having something warm to sip at dawn before heading to the fields or late at night when the body ached provided comfort. It gave a small piece of dignity and sometimes even fooled the mind into thinking it was the real thing. Here's the twist. Chicory didn't vanish when slavery ended. In New Orleans especially, it became a deep tradition. Even today, famous cafes blend chicory with coffee, serving a drink that traces back to the ingenuity of enslaved people making do with what they had. So, while the masters drank imported beans, the enslaved sipped roasted roots. Both cups were hot, and both carried meaning, but only one was born purely of survival. And when even roots couldn't satisfy hunger, enslaved cooks turned to the barest scraps, bones tossed aside, boiling them down into broths that carried families through famine. 23. Scrap bone broth. When the meat was gone, and when even the fat and scraps were picked clean, there was still one thing left: the bones. Plantation kitchens threw them out, but in the slave quarters, nothing was wasted. Enslaved families gathered those discarded bones, dropped them in a pot of water, and simmered them for hours. The result was scrap bone broth, thin and oily, but rich with whatever nutrients the marrow could release. It wasn't a hearty stew, and most of the time there was no meat left on the bone at all. But slowly boiling them pulled out flavor, strength, and just enough fat to stretch plain corn mush or greens. For children and the sick, that broth could mean the difference between weakness and having the strength for another day's work. Here's the hidden truth. Bone broth today is sold as a major health craze. It is bottled, branded, and very expensive. But its roots go back to survival cooking in slave quarters, where it was never about wellness trends. It was about staying alive with bones stripped bare. Survival often turned back to the fields again, this time to the simplest harvest of all: fresh green corn, roasted in its husk over open flames. 24. Roasted green corn in the husk. In late summer, when the corn was still tender and green on the stalk, enslaved families would slip into the fields and pull a few ears. The simplest way to eat it was to toss the whole thing, husk and all, onto hot coals. After a few minutes the husk blackened, the kernels steamed inside, and roasted green corn was ready. The flavor was smoky, sweet, and filling. It was a rare treat that needed no pot, no seasoning, and no scraps of meat, just fire and patience. Children especially loved it, gnawing down to the cob and savoring every bite. For adults, it was quick fuel after grueling days. It was a way to enjoy the harvest before the fields were picked clean for the plantation owners. Here's the striking part. Roasted corn wasn't just survival, it was joy. It was one of the few moments when food felt like a gift instead of a ration. Gathered around the fire with husks in hand, enslaved families found a small taste of freedom in the simplest of foods. And that tradition carried forward. Today, roasted corn shows up at fairs, festivals, and backyard cookouts across America. What once meant endurance now means celebration. But the last dish on this survival list takes us back to the wild, a thin, sharp broth brewed from onions and garlic pulled straight from the earth. 25 wild onion and garlic soup. Out in the fields and woods, enslaved families foraged not just for greens and fruit, but for the sharp bite of wild onions and garlic. These hardy plants grew along ditches and forest edges. When boiled in water, they made a thin, pungent soup. It wasn't hearty. Most times it was just a clear, light broth flavored only by those wild bulbs. But in a life of constant hunger, even that thin soup carried power. The sulfur-rich plants helped fight off sickness, cleared the chest, and gave a sense of warmth when bellies were otherwise empty. Children might sip it like medicine, while adults drank it to stretch through long nights. When scraps of salt pork or fat were added, if any could be spared, the soup turned into something closer to a real meal. Here's the legacy. Today, onions and garlic are the backbone of nearly every cuisine in the world. But for the enslaved, their wild cousins weren't just flavor, they were survival. It was a bitter broth that carried bodies through the hardest days. And with that, we come full circle. From roasted corn to bitter greens, from scrap bones to wild herbs, every dish tells the same story. Survival was carved out of a struggle, creating a food culture that still echoes in Southern kitchens today.